Poetry was not born in celebration. It was born when the voice had no witness, when the heart learned to speak to itself, because the world had gone deaf. It was born in the pause after crying, when tears grew tired of falling, and chose instead to turn into words. That is where poetry began. Pain sat beside me like an old companion, not speaking, not leaving, only reminding me that silence can be heavier than screams. I learned early that smiles can be trained, but sorrow is instinctive. It knows the way home. Poetry came when questions had no answers, when prayers returned unopened, and hope learned to whisper. I did not choose pain. Pain chose me, and in choosing me, carved a language in my chest. Each breath felt borrowed. Each heartbeat sounded like a reminder that I was still here, even when I wished not to be. Poetry arrived without knocking, sat on the floor of my broken thoughts, and asked me to tell the truth, without asking for forgiveness. I wrote not to be understood, but to survive the night that stretched longer than my courage. Pain taught me honesty, because lies require energy, and suffering leaves no strength for pretending. Every line bled slowly, not dramatic, not loud, just steady enough to prove it was real. Poetry does not heal instantly. It does not erase scars. It teaches you how to live with the shape of them. I learned that wounds have memories, and poetry is the only place they feel safe enough to speak. There are nights when the heart becomes a battlefield, and words are the only soldiers willing to stand unarmed. Pain strips you naked, takes your pride, leaves you face to face with who you truly are. Poetry looks at that person without turning away. I wrote when laughter felt foreign, when joy looked like a story told by someone else, in a language I once knew. Pain sharpened my senses, made me hear the cracks in every promise, see the shadows behind kindness. Poetry was not an escape. It was a confrontation, a mirror held too close to ignore. I wrote because silence was killing me softly, and words were the only rebellion I could afford. I discovered that pain has layers, and poetry peels them slowly, never all at once. There were days when writing felt useless, when sorrow laughed at my verses, unchanged, undefeated. Yet I kept writing, because pain hates persistence, and poetry is stubborn by nature. Each word was a step, small, trembling, but moving away from the edge, where despair waits patiently. Pain taught me patience, because healing never rushes, and poetry respects the pace of a broken soul. I learned that strength is not loud, it is the quiet decision to stay. Poetry stayed with me when people could not, when explanations failed, when love felt conditional. Pain made me fluent in the language of loss, and poetry became my accent, softening every sentence. There is beauty in surviving what should have destroyed you, and poetry is proof that survival can sing. I wrote for the version of me that felt unseen, for the heart that carried storms without umbrellas. Pain does not ask permission. It arrives like truth, uncomfortable, undeniable, impossible to ignore. Poetry gives pain a chair, offers it a voice, and listens without interruption. I learned that writing does not make you weak. It proves you were strong enough to feel deeply. Pain carved valleys in my spirit, and poetry filled them with echoes instead of emptiness. There were moments when I hated my own sensitivity until I realized it was the source of my words. Poetry born of pain is not polished. It limps, it breathes unevenly, tells the truth anyway. I wrote for those who cannot explain their sadness, who carry storms behind calm faces, who smile as a survival skill. Pain recognizes pain, and poetry is how it nods back. I learned that broken hearts do not want fixing, they want understanding. Poetry understands, without trying to change anything. Each verse became a witness, each stanza a confession, each silence between lines, a respectful pause. Pain taught me that even darkness has texture, and poetry taught me how to touch it gently. I am not healed, I am not whole, but I am honest, and that is where poetry lives. This is not a song of victory, it is a record of endurance, a quiet archive of nights I survived. Poetry was born when pain refused to leave, and I refused to disappear. Pain stayed, so poetry learned to walk beside it, not ahead, not behind, just close enough to understand its pace. Some nights, pain wore the mask of memory.
Replying moments.
I never invited back. Poetry did not stop the memories. It gave them borders, turned chaos into sentences that would not swallow me whole. I learned that remembering hurts less when it has rhythm, when sorrow learns where to pause. Pain often asked, "Why you?" Poetry answered, "Why not speak?" There were days when my hands shook while writing, as if the body feared what the heart was about to admit. Poetry is brave like that. It says the dangerous things softly so they can be heard. Pain made my world smaller, shrunk joy into fragments, but poetry stitched fragments into something resembling meaning. I wrote when hope felt irresponsible, when dreaming seemed like betrayal. To the wounds I carried, poetry never forced hope. It waited like dawn waits behind the darkest hour. Pain taught me that loneliness can exist, even in crowds, even in love. Poetry kept me company, in rooms full of people, where my soul sat alone. I learned that silence has weight, and poetry is how you set it down gently. Pain sharpened my empathy, turned strangers' sighs into familiar music, made me recognize myself in their pauses. Poetry is not selfish, it is shared survival. One heart saying to another, "I've been there too." There were nights when sleep refused me, and pain paced the room, counting regrets like steps. Poetry sat awake with me, listening without judgment, letting the night empty itself onto the page. Pain does not age, it remembers everything, but poetry ages gracefully, learning softer ways to tell the same truth. I discovered that healing is not forgetting, it is remembering. Without bleeding, poetry helps the wound close its mouth while keeping its story. Pain once convinced me I was broken beyond use, but poetry showed me that cracks let light practice, entering slowly. I wrote for the child I once was, who learned strength too early and softness too late. Pain raised me, but poetry reparented my heart, taught it patience, taught it rest. There are emotions without names, and poetry exists to give them shelter. Pain feels endless while it is happening, but poetry marks time, line by line, breath by breath. I learned that courage is quiet, often mistaken for fatigue, often overlooked. Poetry recognizes quiet courage and bows to it. Pain taught me that trust breaks silently, not with noise, but with absence. Poetry writes to absence, fills empty chairs with words, sets plates for those who never returned. I am not dramatic, I am detailed, and pain taught me every detail matters. Poetry does not rush conclusions, it allows contradictions, lets love and anger share the same line. Pain is not poetic by nature, it is raw, but poetry teaches rawness. How to breathe. I wrote when apologies came too late, when explanations felt thin, when closure refused to show up. Poetry does not promise closure, promises expression, and sometimes that is enough to continue. Pain once isolated me, made me believe no one would understand. Poetry proved otherwise, again and again, through unseen readers and silent recognition. I learned that vulnerability is not exposure, it is offering truth. Without demanding safety, poetry takes that risk daily. Pain leaves marks no mirror can show, but poetry reflects them. Without distortion, I wrote to stay human, in a world that rewards numbness, to feel deeply, without apology. Pain tried to harden me, but poetry kept me porous, open enough for wonder to return someday. This is how poetry lives, between endurance and surrender, between tears and ink, between what hurts and what helps us stay. And so I continue, line after line, not because pain is gone, but because I am still here. Pain learned my name, pronounced it carefully, as if it wanted to stay. For a long time, poetry answered anyway, even when the voice cracked, even when the truth felt too heavy for grammar. Some mornings, pain woke before I did, sat on my chest, counted all the reasons to remain tired. Poetry gave me reasons to rise slowly, to put one word in front of another until movement returned. Pain does not always hurt sharply. Sometimes it dulls everything, turns color into memory, turns sound into distance. Poetry brings color back carefully, never all at once, just enough to remind the eyes what living looks like. I learned that grief has seasons, and poetry is how I mark the weather inside. Pain taught me that time does not heal by itself. It only passes, and poetry is what you do with the passing. I wrote when birthdays felt incomplete, when celebrations echoed, when laughter sounded borrowed. Poetry does not judge missing pieces. It makes space for them, lets absence sit beside presence. Without argument, pain showed me that love does not disappear, it changes shape, and poetry is fluent. In every shape love becomes. There were nights when I questioned my worth, measured myself against expectations I never agreed to. Poetry reminded me that existence alone is an achievement when survival costs this much. Pain whispers lies convincingly, tells you you are alone, unremarkable, easily replaced. Poetry counters softly, not by arguing, but by telling your story, as if it matters, because it does. I learned that some tears fall inward, never seen, never dried. Poetry catches those tears, turns them into commas, lets the sentence breathe. Pain once made me ashamed of my sensitivity, until poetry taught me that sensitivity is perception sharpened by experience. I wrote for the nights that taught me resilience, for the mornings that followed anyway, for the heart that refused to quit, even when it wanted rest. Poetry lives in the decision to stay gentle, in a world that rewards hardness. Pain did not destroy me, but it tried to define me. Poetry gave me the chance to define myself instead. I learned that expression is not weakness, it is resistance against becoming invisible. Pain shrinks the world, poetry expands it again, one honest line at a time. I wrote when forgiveness felt complicated, when anger felt justified, when both needed room to exist. Poetry allows contradiction, because the heart is not a courtroom. Pain taught me that endings are rarely clean, and poetry accepts unfinished sentences without demanding closure. Some wounds never close fully, they simply stop bleeding, and poetry is how to keep them clean. I am still learning how to carry joy without suspicion, how to trust peace when it arrives quietly. Poetry walks with me there too, reminding me that happiness does not erase history, coexists with it. Pain gave me depth, poetry gave me direction. Together, they shaped a voice that speaks not to impress, but to connect. This poem is not an escape route. It is a map of where I have been, marked with pauses, marked with truth. Poetry born of pain does not seek applause, it seeks recognition, a nod from another soul, saying, I understand. And as long as pain remains honest, poetry will remain alive, writing not because it must, but because it can. I continue not to glorify suffering, but to honor endurance, to prove that even pain can give birth to something that speaks. Pain does not knock anymore. It knows the way, enters quietly, like it owns the place my heart once called safe. Poetry rearranges the furniture, makes room for pain, without letting it take the bed. There are moments when the past breathes louder than the present, when memory feels more real than what stands before me. Poetry anchors me, ties me to this moment, reminds me that now is still happening. Pain taught me that trust, once broken, teaches the hands to tremble before reaching out. Poetry steadies those hands, does not rush them, does not shame hesitation. I learned that some goodbyes never happen properly, they just fade and leave questions behind. Poetry writes to questions, even when answers refuse to come. Pain is repetitive, it revisits old places,
reopens familiar doors,
asks if I remember. Poetry remembers too, but with compassion, not accusation. I wrote when my reflection felt distant, when I did not recognize the person carrying my name. Poetry introduced me back to myself, slowly, without judgment. Pain has weight, and some days I carry it visibly, other days it hides behind productivity. Poetry sees through disguises. I learned that exhaustion is not laziness. It is the body mourning what the heart lost. Poetry lets exhaustion speak, without calling it failure. Pain once convinced me that softness was dangerous, that caring deeply
invitait destruction.
Poetry taught me that softness is strength, with its guard down. I wrote when love felt risky, when attachment looked like another way to bleed. Poetry does not deny risk. It only says, some things are worth it. Pain narrows vision, makes the future look fragile, temporary, easily shattered. Poetry widens the frame, shows me time as something I can still enter. I learned that grief does not move in straight lines. It circles, returns unexpectedly, tests old scars. Poetry meets grief wherever it appears, without surprise. Pain taught me that some battles are invisible, fought entirely behind calm expressions. Poetry speaks for those battles, gives them language, gives them dignity. I wrote when my voice felt too small, when speaking felt like exposure. Poetry whispered with me, proved that quiet can still be powerful. Pain once made me resent time because it kept moving without permission.